The disappearance of Roanoke colony involves 115 English colonists who arrived on Roanoke Island in 1587, led by John White. When White returned from England years later, he found the settlement empty, with no signs of struggle, only the word Croatoan carved into it. Despite numerous theories throughout the centuries, there is no confirmation that the mystery will have been solved by 2025. The most widely accepted explanation is that the colonists integrated with local indigenous peoples, possibly the Croatoans, rather than disappearing inexplicably. The case remains one of the greatest historical mysteries in the United States, but within plausible hypotheses, there is no evidence of anything terrifying or outside the known historical realm. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. The colonists toiled tirelessly beneath a canopy of pines and oaks, erecting a modest wooden fort, planting crops, and establishing fragile ties with local tribes. The land was wild, beautiful, and unforgiving, but they endured. Then, almost as soon as they arrived, White was forced to return to England for more supplies, a journey he had hoped would last only a few months. But Europe was ablaze. England was embroiled in a deadly conflict with Spain, and Queen Elizabeth I had summoned every available ship to fight the Spanish Armada. White remained imprisoned for 3 long years, helplessly watching the time pass while imagining what might be happening on the other side of the ocean. When he finally returned to Roanoke in August 1590, the silence was suffocating. The harbor was eerily calm. The fort remained exactly as he had left it. Palisades erected, gates intact, structures preserved. But life had vanished. Not a soul moved. No laughter, no footsteps, no smoke rising from the hearths. The air was heavy, as if the island itself knew what had happened and refused to speak. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no scattered belongings, no recent graves or bones consumed by time. The only vestige of the colonists' fate was carved in wood, the word Croatoan on the fort's entrance post, and the incomplete letters CRO on a nearby tree. White's heart raced. That word, Croatoan, was the name of a nearby island, home to a friendly indigenous tribe. The agreed-upon code, in case of emergency relocation, was to carve the destination. There was no cross, no symbol of danger. Perhaps, he thought, they had left voluntarily. Perhaps they were safe, but fate did not give him the chance to find out. A violent storm broke out as White prepared to set sail for Croatoan. His ship's anchor broke, supplies dwindled, and the crew's morale plummeted. With a heavy heart, White returned to England, never to return. To this day, his diary remains one of the only direct accounts of that moment. His words tremble between confusion and contained despair. It was not what he saw that terrified him, but what he did not see. And so, an entire colony, a piece of England transplanted to the New World, disappeared without leaving a single trace. Over the centuries, the fate of the Roanoke colony has become one of history's greatest enigmas. Early accounts from colonists in Jamestown spoke of tribes with European features and even rudimentary English, suggesting possible assimilation, but nothing has been definitively proven. Over time, various theories emerged: indigenous attacks, famine, internal conflicts, Spanish intervention, and even more mystical explanations. Evidence found, such as ceramics and objects, was inconclusive. The so-called Dare stones, which supposedly contained messages from Eleanor Dare, were eventually considered forgeries. Despite excavations, DNA testing, and modern technologies like LiDAR, the mystery remained unsolved. The story of Roanoke continued to straddle the line between fact and legend. A new direction emerged in 2012 when a researcher at the British Museum analyzed the map La Virginia Pars, created by John White and identified a hidden detail that could indicate a possible destination for the colonists, rekindling an investigation that seemed lost in time. An anomaly beneath a piece of paper, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Using backlighting, an ancient technique for detecting hidden drawings and erasures, they saw it. The faint but unmistakable outline of a square-shaped fort, carefully traced beneath the surface. Hidden under a patch near the confluence of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers, the symbol had been drawn with invisible ink, or possibly an iron composition that had faded over the centuries. What made this discovery so extraordinary was not just the clandestine nature of the marking. It was its location, exactly 80 kilometers west of Roanoke Island. This distance was not random. It corresponded to an enigmatic note in John White's own diaries, written before his return to England in 1587. In it, White recorded that the Roanoke colonists intended to move 80 kilometers inland. This phrase, long ignored or obscured by the mystery of the word Croatoan carved into a tree, suddenly gained new weight. Why had White hidden this fort? Theories multiplied among historians. Some believed he intended to protect the colony's location from Spanish spies, who scoured the Americas in search of English settlements. Others wondered if White himself never returned because he feared what he might find: failure, illness, or something worse. The map, a seemingly harmless artifact, had become a key to the mystery of America's first lost colony. The discovery electrified the archaeological world. Shortly after, the organization First the Colony Foundation, based in North Carolina and dedicated to solving the Roanoke mystery, decided to take action. Under the direction of renowned archaeologist Nick Lucchetti, they began an investigation at this new site, an area along the Albemarle River, Sound, in Bertie County, North Carolina. This promising site quickly received a name that was both somber and hopeful: Site X, and the ghosts of Bertie. Excavation at Site X began with great expectation, but not without skepticism. The terrain, dense with pine forests and intertwined vegetation, bore little resemblance to the traditional image of an English fort. And, as the excavation progressed, the team found no walls, trenches, barracks, nothing that clearly indicated a fort. But then, something happened. Just beyond the boundaries of an abandoned indigenous village known as Metachem, the soil began to reveal secrets. Unearthed beneath centuries of sediment were fragments of English pottery, clearly dating from the late 1500s. These were not ceremonial or barter items. They were utilitarian. Bowls, storage pots, and kitchen utensils, many with the characteristic greenish hue of Surrey, Hampshire products from Elizabethan England. And one detail stood out more than any other. There were no clay pipes. That absence spoke volumes. The settlers of Jamestown, founded in 1607, were famous for their fondness for clay tobacco pipes, which frequently appeared in their refuse heaps. The settlers of Roanoke, however, predated this trend. Their absence there was no oversight. It was a temporal marker. This discovery indicated something radical. The pottery not only suggested an English presence. She pointed to the dwelling. These were not occasional visitors or lost survivors. Someone had lived there, cooked there, stored food there, and settled there, at least for a while. As interest in the region grew, the team used ground-penetrating radar to examine the surrounding area. It was then that a second promising site emerged, just about 3 kilometers away, a place they would later call Site Y. Again, the soil offered silent yet powerful evidence. This time, the artifacts were more diverse. Fragments of European pottery from different regions, suggesting a mixture of cultural origins. This introduced a new possibility, one that had rarely been considered in such detail before. A scenario began to take shape in the minds of the researchers. It was not the story of a single lost colony, but of dispersal, a desperate and intelligent attempt to integrate, adapt, and survive in a hostile and unknown environment. Some may have integrated with local tribes, such as the Croatan. Others may have moved further inland, building makeshift settlements under a veil of secrecy, possibly under the protection of allies or sympathetic indigenous leaders. Site X and Site Y, separated by a strip of forest and 4 centuries of time, began to whisper a story lost in colonial records. A story not of failure, but of fragmentation, not of disappearance, but of transformation. And the more they dug, the more it seemed that the disappearance of Roanoke was not a single moment in history, but a mosaic of choices, survival, and silent resistance. While Site X continued to dominate headlines with its intriguing clues and academic debates, a more discreet but equally compelling excavation unfolded more than 300 kilometers to the southeast, in the wind-swept salty sands of Hatteras Island. Formerly known as Croatoan, this island has always whispered legends of a different fate for the vanished colonists. And now, those whispers were being unearthed in the most literal way possible. At the heart of this excavation was British archaeologist Mark Horton, working in conjunction with the Croatoan Archaeological Society, a local team led by island native Scott Dawson. Unlike Site X, where the artifacts suggested relocation, the discoveries at Hatteras told a story of assimilation. Among the wind-swept dunes and beneath layers of constantly shifting coastal soil, they found unmistakable signs of English presence. A rusty rapier hilt, corroded parts of firearms, and, most remarkably, a slate writing tablet still bearing faint marks of English writing. These were not random artifacts. They were left intentionally, humanely, purposefully, by people who were clearly living on the island, and not just passing through. Even more compelling was the island's oral tradition, passed down through generations among the Lumbee and other indigenous communities. These stories, long dismissed by mainstream academia as myth or romanticization, asserted that white settlers had joined the Croatan people, forming families, building lives, and adapting to their new home. Until then, these stories remained just that, stories. But the artifacts told a narrative that echoed these voices from the past, lending credibility to what had long been marginalized as folklore. Scott Dawson's book, published in 2020, documented these discoveries in detail. His argument was provocative. The colony didn't disappear. It fragmented. Some may have gone inland toward Site X, but others, perhaps more than imagined, integrated into the indigenous communities within Croatoan itself. They were not lost. They were simply hidden in plain sight, camouflaged by the neglect of history. This raised an even bolder possibility. What if both stories, Site X and Hatteras, were true? What if the lost colony hadn't collapsed, but evolved? The science of disappearance. To truly explore this theory, scientists knew they needed to go beyond shovels and maps. This was no longer just archaeology. It was a forensic investigation spanning centuries. And so, the next phase began. High-tech investigative work. Using ground-penetrating radar, the teams were able to detect subterranean anomalies without disturbing the fragile landscape. Next came LiDAR, a technology that removes vegetation in digital scans to reveal ancient structures and landscape changes long hidden by time. These tools revealed patterns, postmarks, fence lines, and ancient hearths, suggesting long-term settlement activity in areas previously considered uninhabited. But the most unsettling discoveries came from the artifacts themselves. Researchers compared pottery fragments, tools, and remains from sites X, Y, and Hatteras, attempting to find connections or inconsistencies. What they found turned the chronology upside down. Unlike the artifacts from Jamestown or Plymouth, where clay pipes, pottery from after the 1600s, and characteristic European items are common, none of these markers appeared at the sites associated with Roanoke. Instead, the materials were consistent with an English presence prior to 1600, precisely the period in which the Roanoke colonists would have disappeared. This meant one thing: these were not merely remnants of later colonial movements. They were the Roanoke colonists themselves. Then came the most impactful revelation: DNA analysis. By inserting data into the genetic code of local indigenous communities, scientists began to identify markers consistent with Western European ancestry, dating back centuries, not as a result of later European interactions, but something much older. Something that aligned suspiciously precisely with the timeline of 1587. And it was at that moment that the researchers said this, first in a low voice, then with a growing tremor of understanding. This was terrifying. If the implications were true, everything we think we know about the beginning of American history, Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, the mythology of the Mayflower, might not be the beginning. The real first chapter may have been written by a group of colonists who had already been declared dead, but who did not die. They lived, they adapted, and then they disappeared from memory. Skeptics versus believers. For every discovery revealed in the red soil of North Carolina, a new debate arose like smoke. The mystery of the lost colony was not just a historical enigma, it had become an ideological battleground. On one side were the believers, convinced that the evidence told a coherent story. The mystery of the Roanoke colony has always divided opinions. On one side, researchers saw new discoveries as pieces of a puzzle about to be solved. On the other, skeptics like Charles Yuan warned of the risk of confirmation bias, the attempt to prove a theory instead of testing it. Meanwhile, voices like that of Scott Dawson advocated a more straightforward explanation. The settlers did not disappear, but were assimilated by the Croatoan tribe. According to him, cultural, linguistic, and even genetic evidence points in this direction, making it unlikely that they advanced into hostile regions in the interior. Within First itself, regarding the colony foundation, there was no consensus. Some argued that the group split up, some seeking refuge with coastal tribes, others heading inland. Others argued that the artifacts found could belong to previous expeditions, and not necessarily to the missing colonists. Evidence such as a silver ring with a European coat of arms, a rapier hilt, and fragments of 16th-century English pottery reinforced the mystery. Enough to suggest a European presence, but not to confirm a definitive narrative. With technological advancements, including ground-penetrating radar, drones, and DNA analysis, the evidence began to accumulate more consistently. Radiocarbon dating became more precise, and soil studies more detailed. Gradually, skepticism began to give way to the possibility of a more concrete answer. And then, in 2025, after years of fragmented discoveries and intense debates, something changed. What were once just scattered clues began to point to a clearer revelation, as if, finally, the whispers of the past had transformed into something impossible to ignore. A patch of dry land near the banks of the Chowan River, a few kilometers from the enigmatic Site X. It was a cold February morning, and the first team, Colony Foundation, had little reason to expect anything revolutionary until they found it, its head facing west and its feet pointing east. The traditional orientation indicated that it would be facing the rising sun on Resurrection Day. There were no funerary objects, no elaborate markings, just the bones, worn by time but intact. A quiet dignity remained in the way it had been laid to rest. But what changed everything was the DNA. Mitochondrial analysis revealed that she was of European descent, and she was a woman. The implications hit the team like a thunderbolt. Roanoke expedition of 1585, composed only of men, was ruled out. The Jamestown colonists? They arrived years later and had no record of having traveled so far inland. This woman did not arrive with explorers. She lived and died there, which meant that others must have lived there too. For centuries, the expression "lost colony" evoked images of a mass disappearance, of settlers completely swallowed up by the wilderness. But now, with the discovery of this single grave, the narrative was being rewritten in real time. That's terrifying. An archaeologist reportedly whispered through tears, "Not just because we found her, but because now we know that others were there too." The colonists hadn't disappeared. They weren't killed all at once. They moved. They adapted. They survived. By this point, the clues had led us to two possible destinations, and two very different ones. The accumulated archaeological and linguistic evidence points to a split migration. It seems that the colonists, once united by the impossible dream of building a New England in a hostile and unknown world, fragmented under pressure. Some, perhaps the most desperate or pragmatic among them, headed southeast towards Hatteras Island. There, among the Croatan tribe, they may have found an unstable refuge, traces of English-style tools, fragments of European pottery, and even genetic evidence in the descendants of indigenous families have converged on this theory. The Croatan, known for their relative openness, may have allowed the exhausted settlers to integrate, although not without profound cultural loss for both sides. This was not assimilation driven by ambition. It was a silent surrender to necessity. Others, it seems, moved inland towards the dense forests around Medicum, deeper into the wilderness. Perhaps they sought autonomy, a fresh start, or simply a place to disappear. In the interior, they could disappear from the reach of potential rescuers, but also from the maps of history. Their decision, most likely, was not guided by strategy or ambition. It was pure survival. The colony had been devastated by enemies that were too silent. Drought, which turned its crops to dust. Disease, for which there was no cure. And famine, which tested all moral limits. Add to this the constant fear of attacks from indigenous tribes or even Spanish forces, and perhaps the most fatal threat of all: internal ruptures, disagreements, divisions. Fear corrodes unity faster than any enemy at the gates. When trust crumbled, the colony crumbled too. So they did what desperate people always do when faced with the end. They fled, not as one group, but in scattered strands, some towards the sea, others towards the trees, and all disappeared. Roanoke colony is more than just a historical mystery. For centuries it has been treated as an unanswered enigma, but in practice it reveals something deeper: a story of survival, adaptation, and the fading of memory. The colonists led by John White left no bodies nor clear records, only the word Croatoan. Today, evidence such as genetic studies, archaeology, and oral traditions points to a more plausible explanation. They did not disappear inexplicably, but were assimilated by local indigenous peoples. The true impact of this story lies not in the mystery itself, but in how it has been forgotten, simplified, or ignored over time. Roanoke shows how history can disappear not because there are no answers, but because we stop searching or listening. Ultimately, the legacy of the lost colony is not its disappearance. It is the fragility of memory and the ease with which human stories can be erased. Thanks for watching. See you next time.